Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Anthony M. DeStefano. Last name is spelled Destefano. He's been on my broadcast twice before, and he's just published an excellent new book. And if you're watching this on Rockfin, YouTube, or Twitter, or X, you can see the well-made book cover. The full title of the new book is Broadway Butterfly, Vivian Gordon, the Lady Gangster of Jazz Age New York, just published June 25th, 2024. And really interesting book, a really fascinating snapshot of New York City and that area around that time, with not just the interesting character of Vivian Gordon, who I knew nothing about, but all the people surrounding her. But like I said, I mentioned earlier, I was on Anthony was on my show twice earlier. We covered two other of his many books. One was titled The Deadly Don Vito Genovese, Mafia Boss. And then the other one was something I was particularly interested in. The Big Heist, the real story of the Lufthansa heist, the mafia and murder. And I will republish those today. I'll put those up after I put this up so people can read through that. Those are not the only books that he's written. He's also done Gotti's Boys, Top Hoodlum, Mob Killer, and The King of the Godfathers. But this will be his latest edition. Again, full title, Broadway Butterfly, Vivian Gordon, the Lady Gangster of Jazz Age, New York. So Anthony DeStefano, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you.
So for people who may not have heard our earlier shows, maybe you can talk a little bit about I know we were talking the pre-show, how some of your other books kind of overlap with this book. Maybe you can talk about your research. I know in the intro to this book, you talked about kind of new things that are more available that maybe weren't available in the past, and what led you to put together this book, Broadway Butterfly.
Well, for this particular book, Broadway Butterfly, I had been doing work on prohibition in the New York, Long Island areas. And, I did a lot of work, and it came across a lot of stuff, Frank Costello being one of the characters, Vito Genovese being another. And in the interim, you look through the old newspaper stories, and I saw about the story about Vivian Gordon and her murder in February of 1931. And I said, what's that all about? And I looked it up, and it was an explosive story at the time. I mean, it took off in the tabloid and the regular press, international press. She was a woman who was supposed to be an informant for a government investigation into corruption in the courts and police department. And after she started giving information, she was murdered, found strangled in Van Cortlandt Park, which is a big park in the Bronx and the upper northern regions of the city. And I said, that's an interesting story. And what made it more interesting was the fact that her death was a catalyst of sorts for all sorts of problems that Mayor Jimmy Walker, that famous mayor of New York, faced. Because everybody said, well, this is terrible that this woman is murdered. She was an informant. The gangsters are running the city. Mayor, you have to do something. And of course, her murder was one of many things going on at the time. Prohibition, the mob. People were kind of getting fed up with Jimmy Walker. And essentially, and I'm giving you the fast version here, then Governor Franklin Roosevelt said that, we have to have an investigation, and he appointed Samuel Seabury to do an investigation of the court system and the police department. And this brought out a lot of dirt, and it didn't sit well with the citizenry, particularly the reformists. And they kept going after Walker. And in the interim, by the way, Vivian's daughter committed suicide, so that's another casualty that infuriated everybody. And after the investigation found that indeed the police were corrupt in the way they handled women who were object of prostitution investigations and were framed and set up, they went after Walker in his entirety, his entire administration, and his finances, which were very suspect and very questionable. And to make a long story short, Roosevelt had his own little inquiry, called Walker to testify. And Walker, of course, saw the writing on the wall and his political allies had abandoned him, and he resigned in September of 1932. And that was the end of his regime or reign as the, happy-go-lucky mayor, liked bootleg whiskey. He liked the speakeasies. He liked showgirls, even though he was married. So that was the end of his happy-go-lucky regime.
Right, and there were you write in the book, 32,000 speakeasies in New York environment alone, right? Just an incredibly vibrant, kind of underground community.
Yeah, you're right, Bill. I mean, some of them were like, really, I guess, mom and pop speakeasies. But then you had the others like the casino in Central Park, which Walker frequented, which were more opulent and more protected, I would say. And they're all over the place. I mean, you're talking 5 boroughs. And you had Long Island, too, which had its own speakeasy operations on the South Shore, North Shore. And, it was interesting. It was just the speakeasies were all over the place. They were
right, but also these showgirls. So, like, maybe before Hollywood was the place to go for, beautiful Midwestern women or something like that, it was New York and Broadway at that time. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, Broadway was the draw for a lot of women who aspired in the jazz age to get into this opulent, snappy life, make it on Broadway, and take part in the good times. Look, like it is today, you try to make it on Broadway, the bar is pretty high, and there are a lot of people trying to do the same thing, and they didn't. A lot of people just didn't make it. Vivian was one of them. She did get some bit roles, but she really wasn't making it as a star. Not like some of a few handful of other women who were doing quite well. Most of these women, they got disillusioned. They turned to prostitution, which Vivian sort of parlayed into her own operation, and were left the city, and because they were in bad straits. It's hard. Broadway was hard. It was the light that attracted a lot of the butterflies, as they say, and Vivian being one of them.
Right. There was that kind of aphorism or axiom in your book: the lights don't care about you. Right. The lights of Broadway are
right.
So it's kind of like that. So you're attracted to them, but they're kind of harsh too. Right?
Yeah, you get close enough and you get singed, or worse. Some of these women who stayed away from Broadway or got disillusioned, got essentially were kept women with certain rich men. And a few of them were murdered in circumstances unclear, but they, met violent ends. Not all of them, but a number of them. And there were some who did very, very well. I think Marion Davis, if I have the name right.
Davies, Davies.
Davies. She hooked up with
William Randolph
Hearst, and she did very well for the rest of her life. But that wasn't the usual story.
Right. So Vivian Gordon had to survive, right? She was a divorcee. She had a daughter. And they ran these kind of like, she had a lot of, like Rothstein, she had a lot of mob friendships or acquaintances, but they ran this Badger scam. Can you describe kind of what they would do to earn money?
Yeah, we call it initially years in the 19th century, it was a Badger scheme where a woman would entice a man into a compromising situation, either expecting sex or whatever. And then the boyfriend would come in and be protective, pretend to be a boyfriend and sort of get the guy to really get very anxious about being exposed, and they'd shake him down for money or something else, jewelry or favors or whatever. This was a variation of what Vivian was doing. In the 20th century, she had a stable of women who would get men into situations where they're having good times, maybe some getting compromised, maybe some giving them gifts, but getting to the point where, when push came to shove, if a person wasn't giving them enough or agreed to compensate them with jewelry or money or whatever, they ran the risk of being exposed. So that was like the cudgel or the sword that was hanging over everybody's head in these situations. Now you play, you pay, and some of these guys had to pay.
Right, and she kind of had a black book, like she kind of was network, so it wasn't this Epstein stuff or this buy, and it went back. The Badger scheme was actually done on Alexander Hamilton. I think you mentioned that.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
It's like crazy.
But yeah, there was a lot of money involved. She ran into Harriman, so all these she's around this environment of wealth and kind of criminality. And we talked the pre-show, like the mafia was just kind of coming into its own, right, in New York.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there were characters well known on the street. There was Legs Diamond. There was Arnold Rothstein, who was really kind of the Mr. Fix-It in New York City. And she's had a tie-in more so with Diamond. And there were other guys around, more so low-level gangsters and some, dicey lawyers who she had relationships with. It was really kind of a strange situation where if you were entrepreneurial enough, cagey enough, and had the right connections, you could make a lot of money. And she did. I mean, she made money, invested in real estate, lived fairly well, but she wasn't making her money through being an actress or a singer. That just wasn't happening. You're right, she was divorced. She had a daughter. And when Vivian got arrested, I believe it was 1923 for what she said, trumped up prostitution charge, and she's probably right. The daughter was taken away from her by her ex-father, the father. And that became a thread that ran through Vivian's life. She was obsessed with being set up and losing her daughter by being set up on the sex charge. And this was something that went back and forth in her life. He tried to scheme to get the daughter back many ways, even with her, mob sort of connections. It didn't work. And, when she died without the daughter.
Right. So she never got her daughter back. She was in jail or a reformatory for 3 years too, right? So
that's right. Yeah. Vivian spent about 3 years of a sentence in the Bedford Women's Institution upstate. And when she came out, she wrote her sister saying, I'm really have a different view of life from based on the women I got to know in prison. And she became hardened. And she became aware of what to do if she was going to do anything to make it in New York. She wasn't going to make it legitimately. So that was the way it went.
Right. So she kind of figured out, but she was one of many women. Like there were other famous, not pimps, but female. Was Adler was her name?
Yeah, Polly Adler. Polly Adler was the sort of premier madam of New York City at this time, and they had a relationship, Vivian and Polly. Polly supposedly, used Vivian in some of her setups, brothels, as it were, or scams. But they went their separate ways. I mean, Vivian had her own ambition. Polly was established, and she had a lot of people who took part in her sex operations. So it was Vivian wasn't the only one doing this, and there were a few others too.
Right. So it's this whole environment, and there's also rich men. So the rich people are getting targeted for all kinds of kind of schemes, right? Investment schemes, and it's really something else.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the cab drivers, by the way, were sort of a source of referrals for Vivian. If they came across a guy who was looking for a good time in the cab or was slightly drunk, he'd get into Vivian somehow. And this is how the scheme worked in a way. They had the cab drivers, much like limousine drivers today might, bring women to or bring men to women, and that's the way it went. So she had a constant supply of clientele, But it was a rough life, and loyalties are very thin in this sort of environment. And she found out, and she got in with people who were very dicey, jewel thieves, crooks, small level guys who were dealing in stolen gems and stolen property and assaulting women to get goods. And she became friendly with some of them, and ultimately, these guys, one of them, Harry Stein, in particular, I believe, was the mechanism for her murder, which I explain in the book. I think was impelled by her former boyfriend, a lawyer by the name of John Radiloff. That's my opinion, is that Radiloff knew that Vivian knew a lot of his dirt, and he was a lawyer, and he was at risk. He was at risk for allegedly converting funds, taking part in a bank scheme in Norway, a passport fraud scheme. And it seemed to me that he had a lot to risk and a lot to lose if Vivian turned on him. And she seemed to be about to do that based on her diaries. And that's where I think the final impetus came. In fact, when Harry Stein went to trial for Vivian's murder, and he was indicted for the murder along with somebody else, the witness said at the trial that, we're doing this to protect Radiloff. And this is, some part of that evidence, which led me to believe that Radiloff was really a guy who was really worried about Vivian. The investigation that led to, Vivian was, like I said, found in Van Cortlandt Park. She was strangled. And they did a fingerprint check, and they found that she had a record for prostitution. And that's when the case really exploded. It went all over. It was viral. If it was a viral, it was a tabloid viral situation. But the papers were feeding off this in a frenzy that was astonishing. Even when I look at the clips today, they were all over the place. Alaska, England, Canada, probably South America, although the papers weren't accessible. And it was a wild story. That people couldn't get enough of it. And when the daughter committed suicide because she was ashamed and embarrassed about what her mother had become, it took off to another level. So that also caused its own whirlwind of scandal. And that's how Vivian, that's Vivian's legacy in a sense.
Yeah, one of the journalists at that time said that it was a tragedy worthy of Aeschylus, or like Homer's Iliad, or something like Greek tragedy. It
was a Greek tragedy of sorts, right? The daughter kills herself, the mother's murdered, and their lives are just, of course they were never the same. And Vivian, was the woman attracted to the city. She had talent. She was a musician. She could play the piano. She could act a little bit and sing. But like everybody else, you're in a rough business, and she wasn't making it. So she had to fall back. Like some of the other women were very discouraged by their thespian ambitions.
Right, and you can see those, like you're talking about the newspaper articles and things like that. You can see them today. Like it was front page news all over. In an environment of kind of judicial kind of corruption, there was that Crater guy who disappeared. People disappeared and were never found again, right?
Yeah, Judge Crater was familiar with Vivian. They did consort in her salons, as it were. I don't know if Vivian had anything on him that she tried to use. It was never clear on that. But Crater, in August of, I think, 1930, disappeared in a sensational missing persons case that still continues to this day. Everybody jokes about, where is Judge Crater? And there's a postscript to this, which we can talk about later, about how some people thought that Crater was corrupt, and welched on a corruption deal and didn't follow through after getting the money, getting the payoff.
Right. Those allegations were all over the place. These guys were on the take or open in Tammany Hall and all this.
Oh, Tammany Hall ran the city. Certainly in the early part of the 20th century, Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine, ran the city. If you needed a job, wanted to work in the courts, the DA's office, the police, get a promotion, Tammany could be your a godfather, as it were. And it was true. And some of the money went to Tammany-related people. And Tammany sort of ran the show. It was the epitome of, the permanent government, as it were, of New York City at that time. And we're talking now early 20th century, Jazz Age, and right into Prohibition. Now, with Vivian's murder and all these investigations, Tammany began to lose its juice because it was shown how corrupt the police department was in setting up women for fake prostitution charges, how in the pocket the judges were to the police, and how in the pocket prosecutors were. Some of the prosecutors, as the reports show, were incompetent, and yet some of the low-level DAs were supposedly getting money. It was an incredibly shocking time when you look back. I mean, the city was basically on the take, and that's what the Vivian Gordon's story is all about.
Yeah, and she was kind of like I think on her gravestone, it's not Vivian Gordon. It was something like Bischoff or Franklin. It wasn't her maiden name, right? Vivian Gordon.
Yeah, Vivian Gordon's maiden name was Benita Franklin. That was her birth name. And she was born in the Midwest, I think Indiana, and was sent to a convent school in Canada along with her sisters, not to be a nun, but to get an education, grounded in Catholicism. And but she was incorrigible and left, and traveled around into that what existed as a theater circuit until she gravitated towards New York. And she really, she did what she could to make a living, but it wasn't very, productive. She wasn't a big star, so she had to do something else. And we saw, what she turned into.
Right, and she was kind of more involved in like the vaudeville circuit too, which was much more prevalent at that time, right?
Yeah, certainly in the beginning stages. And then she ultimately made herself, she got to New York, where she was part and parcel of the Schubert organization shows, which are rival of the Ziegfeld Follies. And she had some roles, and but she didn't. The career didn't take off.
Right. So
it wasn't a takeoff.
Right. So it's kind of like people coming and going. Women would come, try their fortunes, leave. But also like she was friends with Rothstein, was another guy who he got murdered, right? But he was kind of like the so-called fixer of the 1917 World Series too, supposedly, right?
Yeah, that was the story, right? And Rothstein, interesting character. There are a few books about him. He was not only a fixer in sports and a big bettor in sports. Yeah. His bets could sort of, I think, move the market. He was also a labor fixer of sorts. He was used in labor situations to work out deals to avoid strikes. So he was well known. And he supposedly gave money to Frank Costello, in the early period of Prohibition, so that Costello could make his bootlegging deals. And Costello eventually paid him back. And Costello became a big person in his own right in Prohibition. So it's interesting. And of course, Rothstein, being a gambler, had his own problems. He owed people money, and he was murdered. Well, he was shot in a hotel, supposedly during a game, and died of the wounds. So yes, he was murdered. And that, some people say, was the beginning of the end of this Jazz Age, good time mentality of New York City. which was presided over by Jimmy Walker, who really, didn't do much as a mayor. I can't say he didn't do anything. There are a few things that, he got credit for, but he really, if he could spend his time in the saloons or the speakeasies rather than City Hall behind his desk, he would do it.
This is a picture of Jimmy Walker right here. So he seemed to be always attracted to the news. He's really something of a real character.
He was a character, yeah.
And after him was DeGuardia, right?
Well, there was a successor appointed after he resigned, and then after Walker was out and his successor, finished the term, LaGuardia came in, and we're talking about the big reform period, where LaGuardia went after the gamblers, like the gangsters, like Costello and other people. So he had his own little war against the mob and against Tammany,
Right, and it was in an environment where the Roosevelts, the cousins, right, Teddy and FDR are the governors, kind of like bookending almost this whole event, right? Teddy.
Yeah, I mean, Teddy was, in fact, was at one point was the police commissioner of New York City in the early 20th century, and he, was a character in the early part of this period, just before, Jazz Age Prohibition. Roosevelt, a powerful Democrat, became important because he aspired to not only the presidency but also became the governor. So he was a power for the Democratic Party, and had this strange, delicate line that he had to toe because he couldn't come down too hard on his fellow Democrats in Tammany Hall, but on the other hand, he was reading the political tea leaves, and seeing how people were upset with business as usual under Walker and the corruption that seemed to emanate from that period. So he ultimately would yes, he had to do something about the corruption, which he did, but he had to do it in a gingerly way, because by 1932, he wanted to be the Republican nominee for the presidency.
Right. I think he became president in 32, right? So I
believe that's when he was elected. And so his political fortunes, grew after that, and he wasn't too badly damaged. Walker, on the other hand, was finished. He was in disgrace.
And how did Wall Street and the environment of kind of pre-depression, the Jazz Age really was kind of an easy money liquidity generation before the Depression, right?
Well, it's interesting you say that. The Jazz Age has its own mythology where everybody, was having a good time dancing. Money in the stock market was relatively easy to make because we're talking pre-depression. But as my old late colleague Jimmy Breslin said, the Jazz Age was a myth of sorts created by people like Damon Runyon, who saw it as a bunch of lovable characters and scoundrels on Broadway, at which Damon Runyon, used as an excellent source material for his works. Breslin once said in one of his books, a biography of Damon Runyon, that the Jazz Age was a myth because it was a time when some people were dancing, but many more were, and I'm paraphrasing, were looking around for the next piece of bread to eat. And this is true because, you're talking, people weren't making a lot of money if you're an average Joe or Jane. It was just kind of like, it was tough. And if you didn't have the money to make and you didn't take part in the life, you lived in, areas of Queens or the Bronx or whatever, speakeasies, and the good times weren't something that you were going to partake in. Now, I see you have Breslin's book up there. It's a great book, by the way. He did a lot of work on that.
Yeah, and it's also the great Gatsby mythologizes these parties and the kind of effortless life, and that.
Yes,
it wasn't always true, right?
No, it wasn't always true. Um, and Gatsby, Fitzgerald, of course, mined this mythology in his own way, but I think Gatsby had a different take on the American. He used Gatsby as his own symbol for the American dream and excesses of the period. So in the end, I think it reflected more of reality. Uh, that's certainly for another time, but it was an interesting time because you had Fitzgerald, you had Damon Runyon, you had all these characters populating the popular mainstream press and mass media, such as it was. Now, we didn't have social media at the time. If we did, this would have been a different situation entirely.
And New York really was the epicenter. I mean, it always was, maybe until recently, but it really was, pre-California kind of getting bigger or anything. It just really was the lights, and Broadway was it. That was it.
Yeah,
Pre-LA, pre-Hollywood.
yeah, you're right. I mean, it's also, this is post World War One, and a lot of GIs had come back, soldiers. Those who came to New York. The city population was growing quite handily, and it was kind of a situation where New York was the epicenter for a lot of the spectacle that was emerging in the country and the Jazz Age and Prohibition. Look, I'm not saying there were not other things going on in other cities. There were, but this was media capital at the time. As you can see, the way the press coverage about anything that was going on in the Jazz Age and Broadway showed. And Vivian Gordon's murder also showed how the power of the press to drive a story. And it's fantastic to look at some of the old clips. And they took pictures and published pictures of everybody connected to any story, be there a cleaning woman or a low-level gangster or a hoodlum or a miscreant. You would make the papers. I don't know how they did it. They must have had an army of photographers out there to capture these photographs. And people may have wanted to be in the paper. They may have posed for photos so readily. It was fascinating to go and mine the newspaper coverage of the time because it was just fantastic in terms of the sensationalism, the tabloid presentation, and the way those stories would just take off all over the place. The New York Times is doing stories. It's astonishing.
Yeah, artful presentation, like really remarkable. Very, like that we can go. I used to have to go to a library and go through microfiche. I mean, I'm old enough to remember microfiche machines.
Sure.
So it's almost like we're in an era of new research where you can really put light on things in the past in a way you couldn't do it before. I mean, I remember actually slide deck cards for books and things like that. So, like, it's a really kind of a gold mine for researchers, writers, and people because you really can. It's as quick as just clicking on a link or something like that.
That's true. You get to things like newspapers.com or whatever site, and you can mine stuff for decades, and it's so easy. I remember when I was first doing mafia research. This is in the late 1970s. I had to go to the New York Library to go to a special facility where they had the old newspapers bound in these giant green digests with the originals. And you would go through and the papers were like fragile, almost like you were unwrapping a mummy. You'd have to be careful. And you have to read the stories that way. And if you found a story, you would have to take it to their micro copying center, whatever it was, and then make a copy for you. But there were reversal copies, these old stuff. It was old technology. And you couldn't use that much of it because, it was cumbersome. Today, if you want to do a good bit of research about any subject, any personality, it's like the world is at your fingertips right now.
Yeah, no, it really is incredible. And you can find these stories that were lost or maybe not as well known, like the story of Vivian Gordon. It's a perfect example and really a snapshot into that era. Like, so many, it's a story about her, but there's so many other interesting historical personalities, mobsters, politicians, rich guys, rich families. Harriman pops up here. Like, she knew Harriman. That's pretty, I mean, I thought that was remarkable too. Just somebody who studied the Pilgrim Society and that kind of thing. Like, she's mixing with the real elite, who's super elite university club type people, those types of things.
And she did, like as time went on, and this, I think you have to stress that, she became burned out. She began taking drugs. She was, of course, drinking. And she was losing her looks, losing her connections to Wall Street. She tried to set up a speakeasy on her own, but ran into trouble because one of the cops she was going to deal with got busted. And she really was kind of going, it's going south in a way. She was really losing it. And she was, getting into relationships that were episodic and not going anywhere. She was never getting her daughter back. And it was a bad life in the end. And she was looking for a score in the end, I think. That's how she was enticed to get into a taxi cab when she was then strangled and dumped in Van Cortlandt Park. It's a sad story in many, many ways about what happened to her daughter, and a lot of the other women who were involved in this. The one thing that struck me in doing the book, Vivian had a funeral of sorts, and there were, this was a few days after she died. Her brother came down from Canada. He was really inconsolable and really had a nervous breakdown. But he bought a grave up in Westchester County, north of New York City. There was a funeral with maybe pallbearers, funeral director, and one or two other people attending, including the brother. And she was put in the ground, and there's never any gravestone put there. So when I was doing the research for this book, Broadway Butterfly, I went to look at the grave because I expected to see a stone. And I had a hard time finding the grave because she wasn't buried under Vivian Gordon. And she wasn't buried under Benita Franklin, her birth name. Turned out, after some scratching around, she was buried under her married name, which was Benita Bischoff. And the cemetery told me, oh yeah, it's under that. But you go to this site and you'll find the grave, which is fine, but there's no stone. So we're looking around for the grave, and I said, where is it? Are we missing something? What are we doing? It turned out I got a map, a plot map of the graves, and Vivian's unmarked. She's in an unmarked grave next to some other guy who was supposedly a murder victim who has a gravestone. And I said, well, this is very strange. I said, she's of some importance in New York City state history. She was a murder victim. She was a character of the period. So I decided, well, let's get a stone. Let's put a stone up. So I decided, after dealing with a cemetery and doing a search for other relatives who don't exist or no longer living, I decided to put up a gravestone. So in the coming weeks and months, I'm going to have a gravestone put up, a simple marker with her name and dates of birth and death. So if anybody wants to go back and see where she was, they'll be able to find her. Everybody else has a grave, right? Yeah. Walker has a stone, nice grave up in Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Westchester. Rothstein is buried in Jewish Cemetery in New York. And some of the other characters who were part of the story also, you can find them if you want to. But she didn't have a grave, so I figured, let's do this.
Do you have time for take a question, Anthony?
Yeah.
Yeah, Sandra asks, anything about the whitewashing of Irish and Italians true mistreatment in Tammany Hall?
Well, if it's anything about the whitewashing of Irish and Italians true, well, the Irish really were the powers in Tammany Hall back in this period. So I think because Tammany Hall had such influence over the court system, in terms of I think the Irish pols and political powers, I think that's probably true. In terms of the Italians were in some disfavor in terms of Tammany Hall, but not entirely. And the Italians were coming into their own. So were they being whitewashed? I think that if you were a gangster in New York City or politically connected, either Irish or Italian, I think you knew the right levers to pull, and you could get out of trouble. And this was true probably up until about the early 1930s. So I think that's true to some extent.
And this book comes in multiple formats too, right, Anthony?
It does. There's the hardcover. There's the trade. Well, I wouldn't say trade paperback. It's the Kindle version. There's also an audio version, and they're available through the usual places: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Tantor Media, which does the audio. And, you go on Amazon or one of the online sites, you'll find it. Also, the publisher, Kensington Publishing, it's accessible through them. I also have a website. It's TonyDeStefano.com. My name is spelled on the screen. And you can order through the site. You could also order the other books. My book about Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, John Gotti, The Big Heist. You can get them all there. And it's interesting to see, people do appreciate this kind of historical approach to the mob with some kind of, good context and good information, which you really strive to do. The benefit now is that you have more information available. Years ago, these stories would have been a struggle to get. Because as we talked about, it's cumbersome to get the information from the old newspapers. Now you can just do this much faster, much more economically. And you can also get access to court records if you need them much faster. Federal court records, particularly, through the National Archives. So this is a good time if anybody wants to do research for a good book.
Yeah, I see you've got a 5-star review from Nicholas Pileggi he wrote Wise Guy in Casino. So
Nick was a very encouraging element to the story. Nick, as you mentioned, he's the author of the book Wise Guys and also the screenwriter for Goodfellas. And he was like an impetus, gave me information and perspective about Tammany and the old judges, corrupt people of the 1930s and 40s. And another nice send-up blurb came from Dennis Hamill, former news columnist at the Daily News, who's done occasional programs for Law and Order. People like these good stories. They never seem to die. The interest never seems to die. And that's good, right? If you're an author. Yeah. Like
sure.
that.
This is like a snapshot of New York with all these people, not just Gordon, not just Vivian Gordon, but I will put a link to your website so people can check this out. You can see it right here, TonyDeStefano.com. And then people can go and get this book. I highly recommend it. And again, the full title is Broadway Butterfly, the Lady Gangster of Jazz Age New York. And the author is Anthony M. DeStefano. So, Anthony, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, William. It's a pleasure always.
Yeah. Take care. Stay there.